obviously the demographic shifts are not working in the Democrats' favor. And when Trump takes over Cuba, Florida's gone.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Thursday, January 30th. I'm Andrew Walworth. Tough day in Washington and the nation today. Our hearts, of course, go out to the families of the passengers who lost their lives in last night's tragic air crash over the Potomac. I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan and presidential historian Tevi Troy, who is the author of the new book, The Power and the Money, the Epic Clashes Between Commanders-in-Chief and Titans of Industry. So, gentlemen, let's start with President Trump. He declared on Wednesday that the U.S. will send what he called the worst illegal aliens to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Claimed that there are 30,000 beds that can be used. So, Tom, we think of Guantanamo as the place where 9/11 suspects were held, but it has been used to hold migrants in the past, I guess mostly from Cuba. But the optics are pretty interesting. On the one hand, I guess it makes Trump look tough. But on the other, Guantanamo is, in the words of one critic, a global symbol of lawlessness, torture, and racism. So what do you make of the decision to go to GITMO?
Who was that critic you just cited there? Is that like
AOC
from MSNBC? I know. That's ridiculous. Look, Guantanamo, as you mentioned, it's the facility that we've used for a long time. It does have a facility for migrants, and obviously this was a move by Trump. This is part of the entire process, right? And he signed the Laken Riley Act yesterday. It's his first bill that he signed. Happens to be one regarding illegal immigration, and obviously there's a lot of deportations that are happening, and so this is just part and parcel of Trump's. I mean, I guess you could say him keeping his promise that he was going to make enforcing our immigration laws and deporting folks from, especially those who have committed crimes, his top priority. It clearly is his top priority. It got me thinking though, Andy. That, with all of this talk about Panama and Greenland, we should probably just add Cuba to the mix. I mean, we should just annex the whole place. I'm sure the Cuban people would be thrilled to have freedom, and Donald Trump would be a hero. I think we should definitely put that on the table.
Well, Tevi, a little bit to work with there. What do you make of the? I didn't know didn't think we'd go right to annexing Cuba, but what do you make of the Guantanamo
we can annex
decision?
it, whatever.
Yeah.
Look, David Frum, who's not a huge fan of President Trump, had this really interesting insight, which is if liberals won't enforce immigration laws, the people will elect fascists or anyone else who will do it. And every time liberals scream, "How dare he deport criminal migrants?" then they just add to the votes of people who are willing to enforce the law. These are criminal migrants. I wouldn't even say they're going to house migrants in Guantanamo. It sounds like they're going to house not just criminals, but the worst of the worst criminals, people who we don't want in our country. If you live in Oklahoma or Maryland or Texas, you don't want people in a facility next to you who have these kinds of backgrounds. So I think it makes sense if these are really the worst of the worst.
Well, the Defense Department apparently was caught off guard by this announcement, which happens from time to time with Trump these days. And there aren't 30,000 beds there, Tom. I don't think that's true.
Well, there will be. I mean,
I've seen that 30,000 number.
They're going to make it happen. I'm sure. I don't know if the number is actually going to be 30,000, but we'll see. I mean, they're definitely. Again, I think that the actual number is not as important as the action itself and what it symbolizes, which again is that Trump is making illegal immigration his top priority and enforcement of our immigration laws. And there's a lot that, and I agree with Tevi. I mean, look, this is all a reaction to the reason this is all happening is because the Biden administration went 4 years without enforcing the border, and compounding that mistake, they lied to the American people about it, what was going on. And so there is this absolute backlash, or was this backlash, and that's why it was such an important part of the 2024 election, is that people were just absolutely, they were fed up with what was happening. They were fed up with being lied to, and they wanted someone who was willing to take action and sort of, do what they said they were going to do. And that's what Trump's doing.
Can I just
So
add one
Tim,
thing to what Tom said, which I strongly agree with? But he said the Biden administration did enforce the law. But beyond that, they celebrated not enforcing the law because you had Mayorkas, Secretary Mayorkas, gone but not lamented, who would go on the TV shows and say, I've gotten rid of 94 executive actions that made it harder for illegal immigrants to come into the country. And then when illegal immigrants streamed to the country, he said, well, I don't know why this is happening. I can't believe this is such a surprise. And then they showed the clips of him saying, we've gotten rid of these 94 laws or executive actions that made it harder to come in the country. So they celebrated what they were doing. It's not just that they didn't enforce the law, they were gleeful about not enforcing the law.
and so Tevi, you're a historian. That's one of the great reasons we have you on the show today. What about sort of the history of Guantanamo, though? Because it does have this sort of you guys laugh at the idea that it's a symbol of repression or racism or whatever, but it has a controversial past, and this is a pretty symbolic move, don't you think?
Yeah, let me tell you why we left. It's not that we don't recognize, I don't want to speak for Tom, but I'm a fan, so we have some simpatico here. But I think the thing is that we both recognize that people around the world, especially not fans of America, might say, oh, it's a symbol of harsh, punitive tactics. But when you throw racism in there, it's just part of the cheapening of racism that the left uses. Anything they disagree with is racism. It wasn't racism that led them to put terrorist suspects in Guantanamo. It was that people were actually plotting against the United States to destroy the United States. And we saw on 9/11 the dangers of what those terrorists can do to us when we are not we don't want to have our guard up. So I think that's why Tom and I laughed, just the mindless throwing of racism out about everything. But yeah, I understand that some people around the world might say, oh, well, this is America being a hyper carceral state and using these tactics to put people away. But the American people want criminal migrants imprisoned and then deported. That's what the people want. And I think it was pretty clear in this election. And so I think that's what's happening here.
So, Tom, he's announced this as he was signing the Lake and Riley Act, of course. And just wondering, was again symbolism linking those two seemed like a pretty good sort of political move in my view.
Sure. And Laken Riley unfortunately did become a symbol of the sort of illegal immigrant crime violent crime in the United States. And her family came out and said, look, you know, President Trump promised us that he would make this his number one priority, and this is a promise kept. You had Jocelyn Nungare's mother come out. I saw a clip of her saying that, these deportations should have started years ago, and she's thankful that they're going on now. I mean, remember, for as much as folks like to say this, oh, Trump is this is a racist policy. A lot of Latinos and Hispanic Americans support this policy, and they did during the election as well. They don't like to see folks in their communities who have broken the law to get there, and then who compound that by committing crime, particularly violent crime. I mean, this is an issue that really does sort of span across races and classes. I mean, it's just a matter of security. People want to feel secure in their communities.
Well, Tevi, it's been what, 9 days, 10 days, whatever it's been since the start of this administration. I'm just wondering, compared to other administrations, especially on this topic in particular, how would you rate what the president's done so far on immigration?
Well, I think he's been pretty fast to act. I think he's moving with speed on a whole bunch of issues. There's the whole flood the zone theory. Look, Biden was pretty fast also on his getting rid of the executive actions that made it harder for illegal immigrants to come into the country. So there was unfortunate speed there as well. So I don't think it's necessarily a comparison. But what I would say is that it used to be, when you talked about the president's first 100 days, the focus was on a legislative push. What bills are we going to pass in those first 100 days? And now, as it gets harder and harder to pass through Congress, it is more an administrative push. What are you going to do through executive action to get stuff done? And I wrote a book about this called The 21st Century Presidency, about how the presidency is more about unilateral executive action today than it was when Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush were in office. It's just a change in how we view the presidency.
Tevi, can I ask you about that though? Follow up. I mean, how much further can this go? I mean, obviously, Trump is testing the limits. We saw that with the freeze that OMB at least rescinded their memo on this. I mean, Can this possibly continue, or have we reached the limit of what presidents can do through executive order?
Well, it could go further if a president chooses not to adhere to what the courts say. And we saw this a little bit with Biden when he got stymied by the courts. He tried to find ways to go around the courts. So, yeah, I think unfortunately there's more room to grow in this area. But I would rather see a return to the balance of powers where you have Congress trying to do the things that are in the realm of making the law, and the president is more in the realm of enforcing the law.
Hmm. All right. Well, gentlemen, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tevi Troy and Tom Bevan. And when we come back, I want to ask Tevi about the Gulf of America and Google. So don't go away. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I've got with me Tevi Troy and Tom Bevan. And Tevi, Google has agreed with President Trump's geographical name changes. They said they would change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America on Google Maps in the U.S. Trump also wants Mount Denali in Alaska to revert to being called Mount McKinley in honor of the 25th president. Tallest mountain in America. Trump says McKinley was a champion of tariffs. So Mexico's president said on Wednesday she is sending a letter to Google about the name change and its validity. So what do you make of this sort of kerfuffle over what we call things on Google Maps?
My first thought is, oh no, not a letter from Claudia Scheinbaum. What would Google do? This multi-trillion-dollar multinational company. I'm sure they're quaking in their boots. But look, the fact of the matter is that the Google is primarily an American company, and they want to make sure that they're on the good side of the American president, the American administration. I mean, I just wrote this whole book, The Power and the Money, about presidents and CEOs, and how CEOs try to stay on the good sides of presidents. They don't always, which is why there's a lot of clashes and fun stories in the book. But I think that's what Google is trying to do here. By the way, in general naming, I'm in favor of keeping names. We should keep the names as they are. So I don't want McKinley to have been changed to Denali in the first place. I think we should have kept it McKinley. And so, I'm not necessarily going to start calling it Gulf of America anytime soon. But I think there are other people who started with this renaming, like with the unfortunate Denali move. So let's just try and stick with names as they are. I'm a conservative in that way.
Tom?
Yeah,
it's pretty interesting that Google sort of made this move so quickly, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, this is well down the list of importance. It is kind of funny. I saw someone on X was saying that if Mexico, really wanted to fight back, they should change the Gulf of California and the name of the Gulf of California to the Gulf of Mexico, and maybe that's the better solution as opposed to complaining about this name change with Google. So it's not that important, but it does, and it's one of the. I agree with Tevi. I mean, I'm all in favor of keeping the names, changing the names of these different, statues, institutions, landmarks, monuments is part of, I think, the what got us in trouble in the first place. This idea that we somehow have to, update things. I was just talking with, I went to Princeton. I was just talking with someone about they stripped Woodrow Wilson's name from the School of Public Policy at Princeton University a few years back when the mania was on. They were tearing down all these statues and they have to rename all these things. And that's the kind of thing that I think we want to avoid as a country, particularly when there's a mob involved.
Yeah. Well, Tevi, I brought this up in part because it is sort of just the latest mini chapter in this relationship between these tech giants and the White House. Google donated $1 million to the inauguration. They were all there at the inaugural. Zuckerberg, Meta, just settled this suit with Donald Trump for $25 million because they suspended his account back in 2021. They announced they would end this third-party fact-checking. So in your book, it's The Power and the Money, you cover the history of business leaders and their relationship with presidents. Have we ever seen anything quite like this sort of turn on the part of these tech giants towards Trump? Very different than where they were positioned 4 years ago.
I agree. This is somewhat unique in terms of the rapidity with which the counter-reformation happened, I guess. In my book, The Power of the Money, I talk about how CEOs should be more moderate in terms of not going all in for one president and then all in on the next, because you have the receipts, right? You can read what people have said one time or the next. But what happened here in 2017 was the tech giants, for the most part, were so hostile to Trump and so critical of Trump that I think Trump was kind of looking for retribution, and he wanted them to bend the knee at the beginning of this administration. And I think this time the tech giants recognized we've got 4 full years of this guy. It's not like in 2017 where we could wish him away. And so I think they've been taking a much more friendly approach. In addition to that, is the Biden administration was quite hostile to the tech companies, particularly to Facebook, which is surprising because they were so helpful to Obama in his elections in 2008 and 2012. But Biden even said, I don't like Zuckerberg. So, I mean, he specifically said that he's got a problem with the company. They obviously were pretty critical of Musk. They had a bunch of enforcement actions against Musk. They didn't even invite Musk to the electric car summit. I mean, he would be the first guy you would invite to that kind of summit. So I think there's some reasons for it, both in terms of self-preservation, but also recognizing how critical and hostile Biden and his team were.
So, Tom, it does seem like there's 2 things going on. One is that a lot of Trump's policies might be more helpful to the tech companies. It might be a little less regulation, that sort of thing. But it's also, I think, as Tevi points out, it's like just the reality that this is the guy they're going to have to deal with for 4 years. They better bend the knee.
Right. And again, that speaks to, I think, the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. When Trump 1 came in, first of all, nobody thought he was going to win. Everybody, said, "Oh, he's a joke. He doesn't have a chance." And then he won, and everybody sort of freaked out. And not only that, joined the resistance, right? And really tried to thwart him in any way that they could. And I think part of the tech companies throwing in with the left in 2017 all the way up through the 2020 election, quite frankly, was part of the fact that a lot of their employees in Silicon Valley are very, very liberal, right? And so they were sort of trying to placate their employees. I mean, there's a story in the New York Times, Andy, that you'd circulated earlier about this today, about how a lot of these tech employees are now sort of quietly revolting against their bosses' shift into the Trump orbit, and by putting tampons back in the men's bathrooms and things like that. And I think that's, again, when Trump was initially into office, that was part of the calculus of these folks, is like, hey, our company, our corporate culture is such that I can't be supportive of Trump. I have to be against him. That is no longer the case, and that's why I think you've seen, in part, some of these CEOs donate money to Trump and settle these lawsuits and basically take a much, much friendlier approach to this administration.
Yeah,
Andy, can I just suggest
sure.
that putting tampons in the men's bathroom is up there with Claudia Scheinbaum's letter in terms of ineffective resistance?
Yeah, I think you've got that's probably about right. But Tevi, it is sort of interesting because when we talk about Silicon Valley in particular, there's always been a sort of libertarian streak in Silicon Valley that's been somewhat at odds with what we think of as Silicon Valley sort of leaning left. And I've seen that pendulum swing back and forth a couple times as I've been watching Silicon Valley. But I'm remembering in 2018 when I think it was Google withdrew from a DoD contract that was because they didn't want to, the employees didn't want to do anything that would help target drones. The New York Times article that Tom mentions ascribes this to the economic climate out there. There's just the job cuts. People are more worried about their jobs than there were before, and so the sort of rank and file is, as the New York Times said, more muted this time around, and the tech giants who run these companies don't feel a need to kowtow to their employees at this point because they're in the driver's seat.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things going on. Number one is the employees may be fairly liberal, and we're seeing that, and that's one of the reasons why Meta announced that they're going to move some of their fact-checking functions to Texas so they can get a more sane employee base. But the other thing is, in general, the top CEOs of big companies, as I found back in The Power of the Money, is that they're not that ideological. Some of them have been, Henry Ford, Henry Luce, but for the most part, they're not ideological. They care about their companies and they want to have a business climate where their companies can succeed. And so they're more willing to go with the flow of whoever is the leader at the time, whereas their woke workforces may not necessarily be as flexible.
All right, well, guys, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Tevi Troy. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the Democratic National Committee and their upcoming election Saturday. Don't go away. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm here with Tom Bevan and Tevi Troy. And gentlemen, the Democratic National Committee will elect a new chairperson on Saturday. That's February 1st. There are 8 candidates in total who are vying to replace the outgoing chair. Nancy Pelosi endorsed Ben Wickler from Wisconsin. The other leading candidate is Minnesota's Ken Martin. These are both state party chairs. So, Tevi, these are not really high-profile names. What does it say about the Democratic Party that they aren't looking for sort of a well-known national figure to lead the party?
Well, I think it says that many of their well-known national figures have been discredited, especially in the last number of years with all the woke ideology and the fact that we talk about bending the knee to Trump. I mean, these people have to bend their knee to wokeism all the time. And I think maybe if you're a lesser known figure, you have a little more flexibility. That said, I don't think the party chairs matter that much. I think the parties have lost a lot of power, a lot of authority in the internet age. People can go on TV without the parties. People can raise money without the parties. And so the parties are weaker institutions today. So I think the only time you really hear about an RNC or a DNC head is when they screw up, if they mismanage the finances, if they get into ethical trouble. So for the most part, I just don't think these roles matter as much as they used to.
Well, but Tom, we had Laura Trump at the head of the RNC. That's a pretty big national name, people recognize. What do you make of it?
Yeah, well, but the other name, Mike Whatley, you probably don't know, from North Carolina. I mean,
Correct.
look, they're I agree with Tevi. I think these roles have become diminished, and I think their main role now is, obviously communication and fundraising, and attempting to organize. But there are a lot of outside groups that are doing a lot of fundraising, and there are a lot of outside groups that are doing a lot of organizing in these battleground states. And we saw that play out in particular this past year, where you had 3 or 4 different PACs that were on the ground organizing for Trump and for Biden. Because the focus is just these 7 battleground states. That's where it all matters. So, look, I think the Democrats, their main focus, what they need to do, is to try and reconnect with working class voters. That DNA is still out there. They just need to be able to craft policies and messages that appeal to them and don't repel them the way that some of their past policies have with all of the woke stuff. And so we'll see whether these candidates, get that message or not. I mean, Ken Martin, the guy in Minnesota, obviously, Tim Walz. I mean, he was very progressive. It's a very progressive state. They've had a very progressive policy agenda for the past few years. Wisconsin's a little more to the right of that in terms of the Democratic politics. But yeah, I mean, that's the job number one for the party writ large, and obviously the person who's going to be head of the DNC is going to be, playing a role in trying to win back those voters.
Yeah, well, Tevi, there's this new Quinnipiac poll just came out. Shows that 57% of voters have an unfavorable opinion of the Democratic Party. That's the highest percentage since Quinnipiac started asking this question back in 2008. For the Republicans, 45% have an unfavorable opinion of the Republican Party. But it raises the question, I mean, what do the Democrats do to repair this? They're really in a hole.
Yeah, look, what they have to do is reject their left-wing woke groups, the progressive groups that tie them in knots and prevent them from coming up with solutions that are actually helpful to the American people. All they care about are pronouns and transgender and all these things that really aren't relevant to everybody's day-to-day lives. And the stranglehold that these groups have over the Democratic Party makes it very hard for them to then turn around and run an election. I mean, even when you had a congressman question some of the woke ideology, all the groups said, okay, now we're going to boycott and cancel this guy. So I think you really have to have a massive sister soldier moment, which is that famous moment when Bill Clinton in 1992 rejected Sister Soldier's racist suggestion that we go kill white people. And he did it. And people said, yeah, we want to hear that. You know, push back against the most excessive, most insane left-wing progressive ideology, and we will give you better than a 57% disapproval rating.
Yeah, that's pretty much beyond the power, it seems to me, of the chair, Tom. I think that's part of the problem with the party, right? I mean, there's no.
Well, the chair is going to be part of the party and has to be, they have to have it from sort of top to bottom. You can't have, multiple messages. Obviously, there'll be some variance with like House races where people are in a more progressive district. But when you're talking about these Senate races, when you're talking about the presidential race, when you're talking about sort of national messaging, Tevi's right. I mean, Hakeem Jeffries just said, we saw a story the other day that Democrats are going to sort of tune out all the noise and just focus on the economy. And that's great. They should have been doing that 2 years ago. They can focus on things like healthcare and education. I think one of the sort of underreported aspects of the campaign last time is Trump basically owned the word. He said this is common sense, where it's common sense conservatism. It's a common sense agenda to the American people. That's what Democrats need. They need common sense. They can still be progressive and liberal in some of their attitudes, but their policies have to be they have to be common sense and have to appeal to the middle. And we'll see whether they're able to do that or not.
So, Tevi, it does seem that at this particular moment, and one of the reasons why I'm sort of interested in this topic is without a sort of real leader in the Democratic Party, the chairperson could be someone who has more importance than, say, the chair of the Republican Party, where you've got all these, you've got the presidency and whatnot. Rahm Emanuel was one person whose name was mentioned as possibly taking this job. He, for whatever reason, is not on the list of the 8 people vying for it right now. But could the DNC chair be a more important player because the party is in such disarray?
Theoretically, when your party is out of power, the head of the national committee is the lead spokesperson for the party. That doesn't mean they're the top elected official, but they're the first person who goes out there on the Sunday shows to counter the message of the incumbent party. But again, as the party's roles diminish, you think Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren is going to say, I'm going to give up my spot on the Sunday shows for this person from Minnesota or Wisconsin that we never heard of? No, I don't think that's the case. And I don't think they're going to get as good ratings. And not like the Sunday shows kill it on the ratings anyway. So I think the party chair is going to be out there. But even if they go out there a lot and they really spend a lot of time going out on the hustings, we're not going to know their names 2 years from now, just like we don't know their names now.
Tom, can the Democrats come back?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, if they do the right things. But you go back to that Quinnipiac poll. I mean, that was a shocking result. I mean, again, don't just look at the disapproval rating. Look at the approval rating, the favorable ratings, and take the difference, right? Republicans were like 43, 45. So basically at parity, 2 points underwater. Democrats were like 20 something, over 20 points underwater between their favorable and their unfavorable rating. And that is a real, I've never seen numbers like that before. I mean, we track this stuff and follow it pretty closely. That's usually Democrats have a higher net favorable rating than the Republican Party. So to see them not just fall behind Republicans, but fall behind by sort of an order of magnitude does speak to the trouble and the hole that they find themselves in. Can they dig themselves out? Of course. And part of that will be, sort of being unified and opposing the administration, but also they have to do it. They have to be smart about it. They have to be strategic about it. They can't oppose everything. And we've already seen some Democrats, some of them signed on to the Laken Riley Act. You've seen some of the Democratic senators vote for some of these Trump nominees. And so, but there is no current overall plan for the Democrats on how to approach the Trump administration and how to approach the public in terms of resetting public policy agenda. It hasn't happened yet. They need to do it sooner rather than later. They don't want to get too far down the road without having a message that, again, from top to bottom, whether it's the new DNC chair all the way down to, any of these folks who are going to be running for governor in New Jersey or Virginia or the following year for House or Senate, they all need to sort of have an idea of what the plan is moving forward so they can sing from the same sheet of music.
And Tevi, there's this other looming problem for the Democrats, and that's sort of demographics. About a dozen House seats, this is according to the Brennan Center, are going to shift from states that voted for Harris to states that voted red over the next 10 years. We'll due to the census, basically. So you've got this other problem they have, which is basically people are moving out of blue states into red states, and red states, it'll be harder and harder for them to amass what they need in the Electoral College.
Respectfully, I'll say it's not due to the census. It's due to the fact that people are moving away from places that are mismanaged, that focus on woke governance as opposed to actual good governance and common sense governance. The census just reflects the reality of what is happening. And so, yeah, I think the Democrats are going to lose some seats as a result, but it also forces Democrats to double down in an unfortunate way on their wokeness, because the states that represent the Democrats most in Congress, which are California, Massachusetts, Maryland, and New York, are very liberal states. And so a large percentage of Democratic members in the House are from those states. And that means the caucus votes in a more left-wing way than the nation as a whole, or even the Democratic Party as a whole. So I think the direction of the census is giving Democrats less power, but in a weird way, making them more liberal.
Tom, last word.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the demographic shifts are not working in the Democrats' favor. And when Trump takes over Cuba, Florida's gone.
All right, well, on that note, we're going to leave it. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've been talking with Tevi Troy and Tom Bevan, but don't go away. Tom will be back after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined now by Leor Sapir. He is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Leor, thanks for joining me. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So you cover governance and health and transgender issues for the Manhattan Institute. So let's talk about President Trump's executive order. What do you make of it, and how big of a deal is this in terms of a shift in the government stance, at least vis-a-vis transgender issues?
Well, it's a massive shift, certainly compared to the Biden administration's policies, and before it, the Obama administration's policies. Trump's first-term policies on this issue were not nearly as forceful and detailed as this time around. Look, I mean, this executive order that was issued yesterday, first of all, I think we should just mention it makes good on President Trump's election promise to do what he can, emphasis on what he can, and we'll talk about that, to end the practice of medical sex changes on minors. If your readers or listeners are even vaguely familiar with this issue, they probably know that the United States has become something of an international outlier in the last few years, as more and more nations, particularly in Europe, have moved away from what we here call gender-affirming care, recognizing, for minors, I should clarify, recognizing that the evidence for these procedures is, as one review put it, pathetically weak, and meaning that there's no real basis to believe that they're safe and effective, and in fact, they're very likely to do a significant amount of harm. And so this executive order says that the federal government will not fund, sponsor, promote, assist, or support the so-called transition of a child from one sex to another, and it will rigorously enforce all laws that prohibit or limit these destructive and life-altering procedures. So then the question is, what does this mean in practice?
Right.
Well, what it does not mean, I think we can start there, is a federal ban on these procedures. I think that's important because people are saying, oh, Trump just with a stroke of his pen, he ended gender-affirming care for kids. No, he did not. He arguably does not have the constitutional authority to do that. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution leaves the regulation of medicine in the hands of the states. State medical boards, for example, have the authority to set standards and to investigate and penalize any departures from those standards. And of course, in the United States, we love lawsuits, and so we use litigation, specifically malpractice litigation, to set medical policy. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. So much of many of the decisions that doctors and hospitals make on a day-to-day basis are heavily shaped by legal defensiveness, and kind of anticipating potential malpractice. So yesterday's executive order, what it does do is use the tools that are constitutionally at the disposal of the executive branch to limit or hopefully end the practice of child sex change. And there's a number of areas that it identifies as requiring urgent attention. So we can go through those if you'd like.
Yeah. So what are we talking about in terms of, and also,
Sure.
I remember seeing this story, I guess it was a couple of years ago, about Vanderbilt University, and, are institutions, private institutions, these clinics, still be able to function? There's not going to be, does this order only pertain to the government and government institutions, correct?
This order, I think the most significant lever that this executive order pulls on is the funding lever.
It's grant lever, yep.
Exactly. So, for example, there's according to the order, there could be no more Medicaid or Medicare funding for sex change procedures. The Department of Defense is instructed to exclude these procedures from TRICARE, from its government-run health insurance policy. And then no grants to hospitals, clinics, medical schools, any institution that supports or practices so-called gender-affirming care. And so we saw, Tom, just I think it was either this morning or last night, maybe it was last night, Denver Health, a hospital in Denver, announced that it is no longer providing gender surgeries to minors, or to anybody under 19, because the executive order defines a child as anybody not, under the age of 19. Denver Health, according to the news article, gets $98 million a year, and that does not include Medicaid payments from federal grants. So you can see the kind of leverage that the federal government has here just through spending. So, to put it in more concrete terms, if you are, for example, Boston Children's Hospital, that has maybe the most famous clinic in the country, also the first clinic in the country, the pediatric gender clinic, the expectation here is now you have to decide between receiving millions or tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding, and keeping your gender clinic alive. And so I think the hope or expectation is that, faced with that dilemma, hospitals will abandon the practice. And frankly, this may actually give hospital administrators the legal and political cover they need to do what many of them privately probably know is right ethically, which is to stop these procedures. But I know in one case that I've been involved with, and unfortunately can't talk about publicly, that hospital administrators do face these dilemmas. They do understand that this is a medical scandal, and they are looking for ways to back away from it without incurring the wrath of activist organizations and lawsuit-happy groups like the ACLU.
We're speaking with Leor Sapir. He's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and we're talking about President Trump's executive order regarding transgender surgeries, basically. But Leor, I want to ask you, just to give our listeners and our viewers a sense, how big of a business is this? We see it in the news, and we see that some of these gender reassignment clinics are, I guess, hugely profitable. Is that true? And how much money is involved in this, in terms of how big of a business has this whole operation become?
There is money involved here. The organization Do No Harm recently calculated, based on a national database that they managed to get a hold of, that the gender industry has billed so far, between the years of 2019 and 2023, it billed for over $120 million. And that's almost certainly a pretty significant undercount. Some of these procedures are big money makers. The installation of puberty blockers. Puberty blockers are drugs that are, at least in one form, they're installed under the skin in a surgical procedure, and they cost tens of thousands of dollars every few months to change them out. So these are, you know, and surgeries, of course, can also rack in a lot of money for providers, for hospitals, and especially for private clinics. Some of the procedures are less, you know, kind of money makers. You know, the hormone prescriptions, a little bit less. Psychotherapy certainly is not a big money maker. And I'm talking about affirmative therapy, which is a contradiction in terms. Basically means the therapist sits there and says, yes, yes, you're trans. Yes, the whole world hates you. I'm not talking about actual psychotherapy. So, you know, look, there is, of course, money attached to this, but I don't think, and I never have thought, that money is the primary motivator for this medical scandal. Unlike, for example, the opioid epidemic, where there was a kind of a clear culprit, you know, Purdue Pharma, that stood to gain billions of dollars from the overprescription of OxyContin. Here, this is a much more complicated situation involving a confluence of factors, some of them regulation, some of them financial, but most of all, I would say, are ideological. Now, in terms of the scope, because you asked about the scope, how many of these procedures are happening and where? By the way, I should just clarify, the Trump executive order is not just about surgeries, it's also about puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. So look, I mean, up until 20, 30 years ago, if you had consulted the medical literature, you would find that, you know, the percentage of adults who are classified as transsexual, the word at the time, you were talking about, you know, a tiny, tiny percent, something like 0.05%, almost all of them adult males who transition in their 30s and 40s. Nowadays, I mean, just to give you a sense, there was a study published in JAMA Pediatrics a few weeks ago that found that 1 in 1,000 17-year-olds in the United States is on gender-affirming hormones.
Wow.
I mean, just to give you a sense, that's about the same incidence as type 2 diabetes, which the medical establishment has called, and I quote, an epidemic. Now, of course, the researchers who produced that 1 in 1,000 number, they spun the result of their study to say, look how rare it is. So, you know, we shouldn't be concerned about it. But 1 in 1,000 teenagers is not rare. That is extremely common. So, you know, these procedures have become far, far more common in recent years. To give you maybe one last example, the first pediatric gender clinic was opened in Boston in 2007. Today, there are over 100 such clinics operational throughout the United States. So it is a large and growing industry, and it preys, and I use that word advisedly, it preys on children and parents, and it's run by doctors who are fundamentally ideological.
And you know, we hear people talk about obviously there's this being a social contagion, right? I mean, how much of that is driven by our current? I mean, obviously, the as you mentioned, parents, schools, all of the sort of systems that surround these teenagers in some ways have been set up to sort of praise this and support it and celebrate it. And then you combine that with social media, for example, where a lot of these kids, you know, end up, if they you know, are confused or whatever, fall into, you know, a silo where it's becomes clear to them they are told that they're transgender. I mean, how much of this is just a social phenomenon? And is that something that, when you look at the broad scope of this, that, you know, the tide is turning and the pendulum sort of swinging in the other direction, and we will look back on this as a social contagion as opposed to, you know, this tide that just will continue to rise?
Yeah, I don't see how it could be otherwise. I mean, what would be the competing explanations? You know, one competing explanation is that some kids are just born with the brain of the opposite sex. Number one, there is no scientific evidence to support that, as recognized by now increasingly the European medical authorities. And even if there were evidence to support that, it's not as though gender clinics are performing MRIs on kids to figure out if they have the brain of the opposite sex. They're just saying, do you identify as trans? If so, do you want these medications? If so, I'll prescribe them. So, you know, if kids are not, quote unquote, born that way, and you know, if we see clear indications of social contagion, for example, an exponential rise in adolescent girls who identify as boys, the majority of whom also have pre-existing mental health conditions, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, autism, you name it. I think the evidence is very clear that social contagion is what's causing this. And, I would say, yes, all of the factors that you mentioned, social media, schools, encouraging kids to identify as trans, celebrating them when they do, keeping the information from parents, which is another aspect that the Trump administration is now trying to get rid of. Maybe the last thing I would say on this is I shouldn't say even, especially professional medical associations and mental health associations are now defining transgender in a way that it's actually surprising that most teenagers don't identify that way. So let me give you an example. The American Psychological Association says that defines transgender as anybody who has an internal sense of gender or gender identity that's different from the sex they were assigned at birth. Meaning, if you are a boy and you don't feel like you fit the two-dimensional stereotype of manhood, or if you're a girl and you don't feel that you fit the two-dimensional stereotype of femininity, congratulations, you're transgender. So under those terms, it's actually surprising that most teenagers don't identify that way.
All right, well, we are out of time. We got to leave it there, but we appreciate it. Leor Sapir, fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Tom. Appreciate it.
All right, and that is going to do it for us. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder president of RealClearPolitics. You've been listening to RCP Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. Everybody have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow.